There were all kinds of interesting concepts raised. I do, however, as we turn the floor open to the audience, to Duetto Research and to Teradata, to ask one question, a point of clarification to Scott of Teradata, and that concerns the acronym HADOOP. Can you define that for us, just to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to what it means, because it's clearly a pivotal concept and term.
Very good. So, does anybody in the audience know where the name Hadoop came from?
Doug Cutting had a stuffed animal.
Very good.
His daughter.
His daughter's stuffed elephant. Very good. We don't have any prizes. Hadoop is the name of the open source version of HDFS, which is a distributed file system. And as a distributed file system, it's very flexible. As I mentioned, you're able to kind of put files in and put any kind of data in without any concern for scrubbing beforehand or applying any schemas beforehand and so on. And the magic behind HDFS is that it's distributed, which means it can scale and is massively parallel. So that gets to the volume along with the flexibility. And there are many distributions of HDFS. Some of them are open source. You can download it from Apache. There are also a number of companies who have started up that provide support and maintenance for HDFS. So your product cost is very low, but then you can get support from different vendors, and they'll provide bug fixes and things of that nature. And then on top of the Hadoop ecosystem is being built a large number of different kinds of tools for data manipulation, for integration of analytics. There are those who are creating SQL emulators on HDFS, and so there's an entire ecosystem that sits on top.
Good. Thank you very much. All right, let's start with questions from the audience. I have a few odds and ends of questions. We'll fill in if conversation lags, and I can't believe it's going to. First question. Monica, why don't you start us off?
And I'll ask this of both companies. How would your presentation today have shifted if you were presenting to an audience in Beijing?
I would have had Mandarin characters. So, good question. I think in Beijing, I think it would actually have been, I would have probably provided a little bit more framework and discussion on big data, specifically because one of the things that I am seeing in Asia is a different take rate on Hadoop and HDFS. So there would have probably been some more time spent on definition. As it relates to the other components of the BI infrastructure and so on, it's actually very much the same.
Yeah, so one of the differences in our presentation would have been around the fact that the Chinese market's at a very different place in terms of both distribution and revenue strategy. For instance, C-Trip owns whatever it is, 40%, 50% of the market. That creates a very different dynamic. A lot of price setting is them telling you what price they're going to tolerate you charging. And revenue management is very much in its infancy, for instance, in the Chinese market. Although I think a lot of the same challenges, though, apply there as here. You've got a lot of the same system providers that are rapidly expanding in the Chinese market. You also have some domestic players, and some of those are sort of copycats of Western systems, which have sort of even less mature APIs and ways of sharing data than others. But I think the basic challenges they have around data are the same as what we're facing in other markets around the world, and so the presentation, I think, would have been similar in most ways.
Monica, does that answer your question? Do you have thoughts on things that they didn't say?
A number of us in the room are expanding, and the growth of our organizations is in China.
Yep.
And the challenges that we have with some type of unified data strategy is segmenting it to market-appropriate restrictive levels. And one of the challenges certainly we have in China is social media, a completely different set of strategies, limitations and restrictions on the data, and if you are a global company, how do you segment that yet find meaningful ways to share what can be shared?
Yeah, so my experience is particularly narrow to our business, right? So we haven't run into too many of those difficulties in terms of not being able to fulfill the basic functionality of our system. So we deploy largely the exact same architecture in China as here. We're using Amazon Web Services. Currently, we're actually still just pinging back to the US. Since we're not capturing any PII or PCI data, there are no special sort of data privacy concerns that the Chinese might have, although in general I haven't heard that raised very often as a chief concern. Our biggest thing is that we're working with partners there. So China has its own CRS and GDS called Hubs One, which a lot of the major chains now are even basically integrating with to get access to a lot of domestic wholesalers and things. We've partnered ourselves with that organization, and they are building with us a sort of a customized version of the product. The architecture, though, behind it is exactly the same. So the way we handle reservation data, rate data, you know, things like airline data, we use the same source of international airline data there. The one difference is their train system is such an important source of data. We're talking to, it's what called Kunar, something like that. So you have, that's the company, the rail company that has all of that data. We need to go do a special data deal just for the Chinese market to go get that data. But overall, from an architecture perspective, no difference for us. It's just some different people around the table, some different resellers to work with, obviously some language barrier type issues. But part of that was intentional in trying to limit our scope enough such that in Europe and in Asia and other markets we want to play in, we wouldn't run into regulatory or cultural issues. And so that's why we're able to operate in Germany and operate in China with the exact same code base and no specific flavors of the different rules that we have to comply with.
Scott,
Yeah.
Monica's question deals with segmentation. It also deals with PII issues. Can you talk to both of those?
Yeah, you know, I think the way to think about Teradata's solution stack, and not to demean it necessarily, we're more of an infrastructure provider than a specific application provider. So we create the infrastructure and the data platforms that enable the use cases to be implemented. So the definite difference we see is there are different use cases in different jurisdictions, and that can be whether it be on data scrubbing, privacy, and security as kind of one issue, or even depending on the sophistication of the market and where they are in the market cycle, different kinds of algorithms. So certainly with a growing middle class in China, it's a very different market than a very saturated market in North America for hotels, right? And so, you know, it's kind of a rising tide versus we're just trying to steal each other's customers. So there are different algorithms, there are different strategies that get implemented. And so we just try to create the most flexible platform that allows that to happen. There are also jurisdictional requirements on some data, but this is typically more in the banking sector, where certain data can't leave specific counties or countries in Asia. So as part of our logical architecture, which I showed a very simplified picture, we work with customers and we actually build out implementations that can vary based on taking into account those specific rules for infrastructure.
Thank you. Marco, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, on specific segmentation, because we found something interesting. So for example, in the United States, when you talk about segmentation, for example, for a revenue management or revenue strategy, we always think about segmenting people by, for example, how much they're worth. That's kind of the direction that everybody is going, because in the end you have rate parities with the OTAs, and you cannot charge differential pricing by region. Like you cannot give a price of $100 to somebody booking from Ohio versus $150 to somebody booking from California. In Asia, instead, we're seeing that those restrictions don't apply most of the times. There is actually a lot of geographical pricing that you can do. And so, for example, if we were talking to an Asian panel, I would actually talk about how to do revenue management and segmentation based on location. And that's actually something that we thought since the beginning in architecting our system, because traditional revenue management system can only do segmentation one way. We can do segmentation multiple ways by using anything in the PMS, for example, the source code or the rate code or the market code. And so I would see people in Asia using a lot of, for example, source code to say, let's segment people that come from this region as one segment and people that come from this other region as another segment, and then you can revenue manage and price accordingly based on that. So I think that's a big difference between the two markets.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience? Hank?
One of the things I didn't hear talked about is how you move this information around the world. We've got 4,000 hotels and they're spread all over the planet, so obviously the data is coming from all those locations. And to use it, manipulate it, and put out real information requires you to physically move the data or somehow get it to where it needs to go, which is looking to be very, very expensive. So how are you addressing that?
Well, one of the things that our customers have grappled with for a long time is data movement. And so part of the approach that we actually build is whether you deploy it as part of Teradata Cloud or as a traditional on-premise kind of solution. Data warehousing and BI and analytics are about large volumes of data. So a centralized approach, whether it be in the data lake, the Hadoop cluster that's in one place, or in the integrated data warehouse or discovery platform being centralized, where each of your 4,000 points are putting the data in. So that cuts down on copies of data, so you don't have to have data all over the world, except in places where the jurisdiction will allow it, then you may have to have an extra copy. But typically our customers will have one or two centralized locations where all of the data gets stored, and all of the analytics get run in that place, and the answers get shipped back. Keep in mind, the answers are very small, so that transmission is actually not a big deal, right? And when you think about kind of a distributed system of 4,000 properties, each just submitting their transactions, each of those things in and of itself on a near real-time basis is not a lot of network bandwidth, so it's not traditionally expensive. But now you've got 10 years of information plus your website running in your data center, having that all kind of inside the four walls or one boundary, so you're not going over a WAN. Is where our customers get some real effective cost realization out of their strategy. And then you move the processing to the data, so the processing happens inside those four walls, so you're not moving data around even in your infrastructure. You kind of play it where it lies. You move the processing to the data, and you simply ship the answer back. And so when you look at it and thinking about our largest customer, which is an e-business with his 87 petabytes of information, right? That is in a single place, but it serves up users all around the world, right? And the answer sets are actually very small. But when I think about what they do in a day's time, they'll manipulate 10% of that data in a day's time. So it's heavy processing, small answer. Run the analytic, tell me yes, no. Here's the offer you should give Scott. Here's how you should price it to Scott. That's actually very small from a transmission perspective.
Patrick, this must be an issue for you as well, this whole plumbing concern, because you're dealing maybe with a CRS for internal transaction information, but you're talking about using more and more external sources as well. So you'll have a bigger picture, accessing the big data. How do you make the plumbing work?
Yeah, so we certainly have a lot of diverse sources, and it's getting more and more diverse. And how we get that in varies a lot partner to partner. In terms of storage for us, we're currently still storing everything in Oregon, right? The AWS in Oregon. And we're serving global customers with hotels across multiple continents. Right now, I think the answer that was already given is how it works for us, which is we have very large data store and a lot of computations that have to happen there. But the answers that have to get returned to the end user sitting at a hotel in Da Nang, Vietnam, or in Eastern Europe somewhere is actually a very small amount of data that needs to be passed. Now, AWS can give us global scale to have data centers and to house certain things close to the user, particularly something that needs to be cached and readily accessible. We've also, though, discovered a lot of flexibility where we thought that there was a customer in Europe that was, despite the fact that we can comply with European law without it, their lawyers were saying, we'd feel a lot better if you just kept our data inside the EU. Well, we could identify exactly what those data elements were that they wanted to only keep inside the EU, spin up a server, a data store in the European Union in one of those data centers and only manage that data there that had to be, and have the rest of it still live in Oregon. We had another vendor or another customer who never wanted their data to touch the United States. I think it's a little silly, actually. I mean, they're not like an illegal. Anyway, I don't know why they're so sensitive to no data ever coming into the United States, but you know, we had flexibility with them to say, okay, if your metadata is still stored here, is that okay? The answer was yes. You know, a long list of different things that they actually were okay being in the U.S. We identified exactly what they would need outside, and we were going to be able to spin up, you know, an instance outside the U.S. to fit their needs. I mean, I think in general, cloud-based technologies provide very inexpensive, targeted ways, you know, in specific use cases of being able to solve some of these problems, and that's how we've dealt with it. Although to this point, again, we haven't ran into so many issues of just keeping it all central here in the U.S. and have people access it remotely from around the world. Jayesh, I don't know if I misspoke or if there's anything we should elaborate on from a technical perspective in terms of how we've solved it, or
No, I think
how we would plan to solve it.
I think you touched on most of the major points. I mean, as Patrick said, you know, our application is deployed on Amazon AWS. So, and we are basically end up being the central data store for, say, you have a few thousand hotels. It will probably take a while to get those initial, you know, past history of reservations and, you know, a few hundreds of thousands of records. But once you've got, you only need to do that once. And then the ongoing day-by-day reservations, that's not a ton per, well, that's not a lot per hotel. So we can easily, you know, scale our service horizontally to accommodate more and more hotels and sort of accept those API requests as they come in. And we can probably deploy anywhere, you know, outside the US, wherever Amazon has a data center, and sort of have a standalone service if needed. So from that standpoint, I don't think it's going to be a very large concern for us as well.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Hank, did that answer your question? Or do you have a follow-up?
The follow-up would be, you're both talking about collecting information from other sources that are not necessarily internal to the company. Going out and tracking airline traffic, weather, all of these other things, which obviously affect the business that's coming to properties and how they're going to react. We also have one or two people at every hotel that are asking questions all the time about that data. So the putting the data down, capturing it, looking at all these other sources, it seems to me we're talking about lots of different types of data and lots of types of movement that all have to be classified and pre-thought out. How big is that effort? And how much effect does it have on the processing that's going on? We're a 24-hour company. There is no time that we're not doing business or people aren't active. So how are you doing this and keeping it all straight?
So, totally agree. So I would answer in a few different ways. One is when you're trying to answer very, very specific questions that are close to an operator at a particular location, you know, around the world, I think that's where vertical software as a service companies are going to be taking over most major industries around the world, because horizontal platforms, horizontal applications have a very difficult time building tailored solutions that the users actually know how to interpret. So if you're building a system that would be an application that's a real decision application that would be used by people in telecom, banking, energy markets, and hotels and others, it's going to have a lot more settings than it needs to. It's going to have very generalized views of the data. It's going to have a lot of things that are made to be flexible because they don't really know what the needs of their users are going to be. Well, that's, in my experience anyway, that's where a lot of those questions, those day-to-day questions come from, is in people wanting to know, well, how do I tease out exactly what it is I need? Because, you know, I'm a boutique hotel, you know, I've got 85 rooms, I'm, you know, in the limited service market. I don't see how this general sort of implementation is matching my needs. Well, the whole reason why vertical SaaS is becoming a buzzword, at least in the technology circles, is because you develop a solution that is very, very specific to, let's say, the hotel industry. And you say, okay, here's the flavor of it for a revenue manager. Here's the here's the use case for a GM. And then you further segment it by, limited service, resorts, casinos, big box hotels, all of the different types of hotels, such that you can present the answer in the hands of the individual exactly as they understand it and need it. And you've got a constant feedback loop of iterating to make sure that that's working. Now, for us, we have a service organization that currently is based in the US and will be spread out around the globe eventually, that Marco manages. We provide all of that support always unlimited for free. And the reason that we do that, and we'll probably continue to do that, is that it puts a very strong onus on us, because it's hard dollars for us, where if your people, let's say, are calling us all the time and needing assistance, it's going to cost us a lot of money, and we're not billing that back. And so what that means is we then either have to develop self-service training materials that are so easy to use that we won't be getting those calls anymore, or JAYESH needs to fix it in the application. Because that answer isn't as simple, it isn't fitting the use case the way we need it to, and the product team and the engineers have to then go in and say, okay, we're getting way too many questions about how to set up X, or how to interpret Y. And that forces us to then engineer the fix rather than just sort of throw people at it, throw resources at it, and either treat it as a cost for us or as a cost to the customer in sending it back to them. In a global 24-hour-a-day industry, things like that, I think that's why tailored applications are going to be so important. And then hiring people that really understand the domain to answer the phone. So in your case, where you have an internal organization to provide that, yeah, I mean, you end up needing to hopefully develop better and better systems that have less questions, and then hire people who really understand each of those disciplines to be able to answer those questions that bubble up from your franchisees and managed assets around the globe that have questions.
Good. Okay. I want to ask Teradata the same question. As I thought about Hank's question, he seemed to be talking about capabilities, plumbing, usability, and also about governance. Tell us what your thinking is, what your approach is to both those sides of the coin.
Okay. Before we get into governance, let's take another perspective on the cost aspect of this thing. I think that's really what your question was originally. Was it costs a lot of money to build out this infrastructure to get a return? And the reality is, at least from my experience, I run travel, transportation, hospitality, and distribution for Teradata. And I find that let's take travel alone, the airlines are far ahead of the industry in terms of analytic capabilities versus, say, the hotel industry and lodging industry. I'd say the gaming industry is ahead of the lodging industry. I would say the car rental industry is now ahead. As of recent developments, the car rental companies have made significant investments in analytics over the past few years. And I see lodging coming on board now. Granted, lodging is complicated with franchises and all that, so it's a different model slightly. But the point I want to make is that these companies have already wrestled with that problem. That problem has been solved, the cost and the benefit problem that being. So at the end of the day, you're making an investment to get a huge return. And what we're seeing is returns in the tens of millions of dollars on $1 million investment. So it's a huge return to have analytic capabilities. Now, it's part of our job to, granted, we can't give it to you on a silver platter what your answer is in terms of what that value really is, but it's part of our job to help you get to that answer quickly. And frankly, you're not going to get any funds approved toward this investment without some justification in writing committed to by the business. So our group tends to work closely with the business people to build out a justification that shows a roadmap over time. In the first 6 months, this is the return you can expect if you start here, given where you are today, and the next 6 months and so on. So in 6-month chunks, you have to get a significant return, and it's all dependent upon where you are today and what your infrastructure looks like, and where you want to go and how fast you want to get there. Oftentimes priorities come up, of course. CRM is the priority today. So you divest or you move your funds into that to solving that problem perhaps today. And then digital marketing becomes a priority one day. So whatever the priorities may be, the short answer to us is you have to have a return on every investment. And we see this in every industry we sell to, frankly. And I think the good news for the lodging industry is that the airlines have already done this. The car rental companies are doing it. The gaming companies have done it. So I think the how to do it and the proof of value is already there. And I think that it's up to us to help educate you and your business people and work with your business people to help build those justifications. And with respect to the big data aspect of it, we find that some companies might start with a discovery platform and not go the Hadoop direction and just discover, just find some nugget, some use case, and get some value, and then move into it deeper and further with, say, Hadoop capabilities. Others might say, I want to invest in a data warehouse first and integrate what I have, get all that data, all that transactional data, all that customer data in one place, and then I have a foundation to go do other things that I can bring those web logs in with the integrated data that I already have built. So there's a lot of components that Scott mentioned earlier, and each one of them is evolving. And the only way it works is if you get a huge return on that investment, because you're right, it's not cheap. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you. We've got a question.
Actually,
on the governance? Okay,
one
thank you.
extension on what you described, and maybe hoping at least to decode some of the code that we're talking here. I think I think we at Teradata kind of come at it from a very different perspective than a lot of others. So we are data focused and not application focused. And you can't, and by the way, you need application focus for the vertical integrated applications, operationalizing, delivering things, and that's absolutely a very important thing. But where Teradata has made a very large business, almost $3 billion annual revenue business, is in the value of actually integrating and thinking as a data-centric person and not as an application-centric model. And when you think as a data-centric perspective, it's application neutral. We don't care what the applications are. I don't care who's using them. I don't care what the analytics are. I don't care about, what I care about is capturing all of the data, putting it in a place where I can get back to it, where I know what's there, and being able to integrate the things that need integrating in a very easy fashion. So your example was, people may say, hey, I want the weather forecast because that's going to impact my thing, and I need to deliver that to some hotel in Jibit, right? How do I go do that? Well, if you have a data architecture that's not an application architecture, it's a data architecture. Okay, where am I going to go source weather data? By the way, you can source weather data in a lot of places. It's not particularly big weather data, but it's interesting. The structure is interesting. And you can purchase it, you can add it, and if you've laid out your data architecture, where the entities are, how they relate to each other logically, physically, and you've got that roadmap, you can say, okay, now I've got weather data, I plug it in here. And now for my application that's on the desktop for the hotel manager in Dubai, right, there's now another attribute that includes weather, and it just flows through, right? And if the application can consume it, then it just flows through. So I think the key thing here is that you need to separate your application strategy from your data strategy, and you absolutely have to have a data strategy to survive in this world today, especially with big data and all this other stuff going around. And examples of that include, and we've done a lot of business with a lot of companies, and Tony mentioned even in this vertical industry, right, where folks who didn't have a data-centric perspective on their enterprise but bought lots of applications. That's great. Those applications were built and delivered and deployed, and they were able to operationalize and do things in the business that were important. But when they looked at it, the cost became unsustainable because there were multiple copies of the same data in different formats from different sources. Sometimes they didn't agree, right? So what is $1 of revenue? This system shows I've got $50 of revenue today. That system shows I've got 75, which is right. You lose trust and you add cost. And so having a data strategy is really important because you can reduce cost by having fewer copies of data. You can create the traceability and the sophistication so that the systems don't have different answers depending on who asks and which application. And when you get these new data sources, it's very easy to say, okay, I'm now going to go source additional weather data. Here's where it fits. Here's where I'm going to plug it into. I'm going to put it in these sources, these sources, these sources. Now, those applications that I have delivered plug into my data structure in this fashion. Therefore, you know, I've added weather data. These 16 applications can now add this to their screens. And that's a way to really take cost out of the long-term ownership of data and turning data into intelligence. Now, I'm waving my hands and making it sound really simple. You asked like a cost thing, and you know, when I mentioned before about, you know, open source being like free, like a puppy is free, and product cost isn't always the first thing you should consider, your data management strategy and your transformation and your data movement will be what you potentially spend the most money on, not buying products from any of us. All right, so it's important to get that strategy right. Lay out your architecture and determine what you need, where you need to deliver it, and then optimize that, and that's where the biggest bang for the buck will be.
Good. Thank you. We've got Matt, you had a question?
Yes, so actually my question is for my peers. My question actually goes back to the source. You know, the agenda here is big data and analytics, but we haven't really talked about what is big data. So the premise is that the hospitality industry has a problem with big data, so we need to go acquire some new technologies and deploy them, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to ask everybody, roughly, approximately, how big do you think your data set is?
I don't know if I can answer that question. The way I would answer it is, this always turns into a conversation about how you find this data, how you transport this data, how you transform it, and how you collect it all in one place, and how you, as a result, learn interesting things about it. And it never really goes to the next stage, which is how do you deliver the right piece of information to the right person at the right time on the technology that that person is using today. Because I would like to live in a world where there is a commercially available software as a service solution for the vertical hotel industry so that everybody in my enterprise is using the same piece of technology. But I don't live in that world, and that solution doesn't exist, and it doesn't seem likely that it will exist soon. Certainly not soon enough to help me in my career. So we never get to that point, which is how do you actually deliver this? And this is where it falls down. And I accept the analogy with the airline industry, except what the airline industry does is capacity constrain so that they run the equivalent of 85 to 90% occupancy. If my hotels ran 85 to 90% occupancy every single day of the year, I could produce some great revenue management improvement results off of that. But when they run 50% occupancy, like most of the mid-scale runs, it's quite hard to leverage a few pieces of information the same way to get the same result.
Vineet, you had a follow-up?
Sure. So just in response to your question about how big is that data, so we're actually going through that process right now, and we're dealing with exactly the same issues which you were talking about, and Scott, is we have gone through how many data sources we have, how much data we have, and how many different warehouses we have. And obviously we're seeing the same issue is the financial data coming out of one system is different from what we're seeing from another system. So what we believe the answer is to start with governance, right? Is to start with governance. Because until we put the right governance in place, it's not going to get into control. So it's a big, big nut to crack. Because if I look at our guest data, we have in the order of 30 million records over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're not a huge company, so I can just imagine for some of the larger companies how much data they have. Right? So from a hospitality industry perspective, even before we look at future data sources, I think the bigger nut to crack is how do you take the current set of data and make sense out of it. So the process we're going through is hit the governance piece first, and from that we hit the output piece is that an end user is only allowed to see specific data from one source. Then we go and fix the back end. Because if we try and crack the full piece in one shot, it'll never happen. And you're totally right, the cost will be enormous, right? So it has to go through in steps, and the amount of data is huge.
I'd like to let Teradata respond to that, but first I'd like to ask Duetto Research. There must be times when you end up saying we have great revenue management information, we have insight, but delivering it in a relevant, timely manner to the end user is difficult. Somehow closing that last mile is not easy. Have you been able, do you focus on that? Have you been able to make progress on that last mile? And then we'll ask the same question of Teradata.
Yeah, and so there is a reason why we call ourselves a revenue strategy instead of revenue management. And that actually goes to the example that you just did. So first of all, the hotel industry is not a capacity-constrained industry like the airline industry. And you have a lot of hotels where you have half of the hotel empty most of the times. So you need to start building a vertical application that can actually react to all these different scenarios, and not just when the hotel is basically running at 120% forecasted occupancy. So that's one thing that we do. In delivering, because our application, for example, relies a lot on alerts. And we can do that because we're cloud-based, we're web-based, we're soon going to have a mobile application that actually is going to send you all these alerts on your mobile. We're not seeing that as a big problem compared to other systems that I've been used to using in my past, because the data is actually refreshed quite frequently. And our computation, because again, everything is done in the cloud, is fairly inexpensive. And so, for example, a user can run an optimization 100 times in a day if they want to. So, of course, it's not going to be scheduled that way. But there is a button, and the user can do that. And every time you run the optimization, you get all the new relevant information that you want, for example, changing the price. And so I don't see, I don't know, Patrick, if you have anything to add, but I've never seen that as a concern to us in delivering the actionable items in a frequent and timely manner to all the users. I actually think that's one of our biggest strengths.
Okay. Scott and team, from your perspective, may I ask you your thoughts on Scott's thought with respect to closing that gap for relevance?
Yeah, I'll give my perspective from a business side of it, and then let you guys from a more technology-focused side. But first of all, on the comment about trying to standardize, source systems, from a reality perspective, it's not done today. It's not going to be done, and those are things that are consistently going to change. And I think that's, again, from our perspective, we try to approach it as being as flexible of an infrastructure as you can have, because as those source systems continue to change, all of the different customer touch points that you have are going to change, and you're going to need to be agile and able to respond to business changes. And that's a big part of how we approach especially a topic like data governance. You can't boil the ocean and try to go figure out all of your data definitions in one current project, because it has to be focused on what's going to be driving value to your business. And so we try to tie in the governance side of it with the strategic business side of it. So where are either the business pains today, as I think Tony said earlier, is it a CRM pain point? Is it a particular point solution like a revenue management solution that needs to be installed, that can drive immediate value? And you kind of continue from that perspective of hitting the business value and showing ROI as you move through it. But at the same time, when you're making those data decisions, documentation, you're doing so from a long-term perspective of what is the long-term goal of the enterprise.
On your website, you use the term appliance. And you say you offer various appliances. Does that provide the toolkit that Scott needs to bring relevance, or is there still a gap?
Really, the key is two things, I think. First of all, what Brian was talking about with a business-led process, right? So if your priority is price optimization or revenue optimization is the first thing you want to tackle, right? Then you're going to bring the data in that is relevant to that, to Brian's point, with an eye to who else is going to use that later, right? So reservation data, for example, is used by revenue management, it's probably used by finance, it's used by the marketing folks, so you need to have it to the governance point. Everybody needs to agree on what reservations are, right? So those are hard discussions, That's harder than doing the technology, frankly. So a lot in some cases, a little in others. So that's point one. And then point two is organizing it in a way that it can be leveraged across lots of user constituencies in a data model is very important as well. So we do this with all of our major industries. There's a travel and hospitality, not to be a commercial, but a travel and hospitality data model. That includes reservations and PMS and customer and group and all that kind of stuff, right? So not that necessarily that's the perfect answer, but somewhere there needs to be a consideration of how this is all going to relate to each other in the data warehouse, right? And then you can supplement that on the big data side, if you will, later. To Scott's earlier point, most people tackle the integrated data first and then move on to the big data environment if you're starting from scratch, right? All of you, I'm sure, have data warehouses. All of you, I'm sure, have data in various places. But we find the model is really a good roadmap to begin to say, okay, if I have res data, it's going to be used in these 5 places, or star data is coming in, it's going to be related this way to my reservation data or my pricing data, and it's going to show in the competitive markets this way. And then from a sourcing perspective, as that comes in, you know, CRS is a big source, certainly. Typically, those are fairly centralized. So again, you're not looking at 4,000 CRS systems, I hope. PMS can be a little more decentralized, but on an individual property basis, it's not a lot of data. So, to the earlier points, but that's kind of how we look at it. Okay. So the model is a key to getting it right.
Thank you.
When I think about our business, right? Our business is we sell appliances and we have products and software, but we have a very large consultancy, and that's not for anything other than when you take a data-centric view of the world, it's not a one-size-fits-all, because your business is very unique to how you want to run your business and may have some very specific things that your neighbor's business doesn't have. That said, to Dave's point, what we found is in vertical industries, there's 80% commonality behind the actual logical data model that needs to be implemented. So we show up with that, so you don't have to burn your resources doing it. We say, yep, we've done business with 30 companies in this vertical industry. Here's 80% of the work done. Now let's talk to you about your specific business and what's unique. What do you think is not here? And then we built that as a roadmap. And then to Dave's point, and before I had this opportunity with TERADATA, I was actually in our consulting group in the retail vertical. In many instances, we would come in with these models, and we would be kind of like the third party to help all of your people talk to each other, right? And we're the neutral party, right? So it's because it's harder than technology. It can be political, right? A region manager or a hotel manager has a certain view, and this is the way it's going to be, and doesn't want to agree with another region manager and so on. So we come in and actually become arbitrators of this. Now the good news is we show up with the assets, so it's not an endless exercise in expense and consulting. We come in with the assets. All right, what's special to your business? What are the topics you want to tackle first? All right, we'll cordon off this piece of the model now. Let's look at this. Now let's figure out how we source that. Where does it come from? Does everybody agree? Boom, we're done. We put it into place. And I would say that in 95% of our implementations, we'll do that for one application or one subject area, but it's an extensible process. Then we come back and say, now I want to do revenue optimization. Okay, well, for revenue optimization, I need these 5 data sources. I already did 3 in the last project, so I don't need to do that again. They're already done, and they're in this place. It's extensible. So I only need to go get 2. So we actually see then an acceleration of the value relative to the cost over time. So don't boil the ocean. Pick a subject area. Pick a trusted partner with some templates, and take a data-centric view if you really want to take that cost out.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the same question of both companies. I'm going to start with Duetto. And Duetto, I read on a brand's website the instruction or the admonition, stop thinking small about big data. So I'll ask Teradata about that in a minute, but I want to ask you whether this small thinking is what you're referring to when in your presentation you're talking about APIs and needing to think differently about the volume of data we have to move in order to be effective. Are we thinking small? Are people embracing the idea of open APIs or moving to something that transfers data more efficiently for revenue management purposes?
I don't think we have been. I mean, one reason why we were interested in participating today is that I don't think there is an ongoing Htng effort, Doug, I'm sure, or Jay will correct me if I'm wrong, around trying to create, bulk API standards for the industry. In terms of whether or not we're thinking small, I come from a very specific domain. So I keep coming back to the domain that I know really well, which is the sort of related revenue strategy disciplines. And what I find is that there's been almost no, that's too strongly stated. There's been too little innovation in that area in more than a decade. The data that's being used, the algorithms that are in place are really the same overall as they've been for at least the last 10 years and probably longer. And what's changed is the external environment has changed rapidly, and hotel companies are continuing along their sort of internal roadmap of modernizing these big systems that they put in place or working with the applications that have been on the market for quite a long time. And the competitors of hotels, who in my area, I consider the competitors to be the people that are competing for bookings. I mean, most of the hotel brands, the number one thing that they do is drive cost-effective bookings. I mean, that's my view. And they are doing that less and less efficiently. Now, the brands, I think, do have a strong position because they're holding their own better at this point, at this moment in time, than the independents are. And the independents are in a very difficult position, particularly with people like Google and others starting to take a bigger share, and they haven't really started that. They've started, but the economics haven't flown through. I think the thinking small is the actions that are being taken today, I actually think play into the hands of all of those intermediaries. And as we spend another few $1 million a year, we're actually perpetuating an industry structure that people external to the hotel industry have already figured out how to leverage to their advantage. And as new technologies like mobile and search and others are coming forward, we're falling farther and farther behind, and the gap is getting wider, and we keep focusing on all of the wrong things. And so in terms of thinking small about big data, I think it's not even about the data necessarily itself. It's about the business model. It's about the strategies that the marketers, revenue managers, salespeople, and all those people need to be combining together, coming up with a vision on how to fix this problem, and then coming back to the data. Then coming back and saying, if we're going to fix this, what data do we need? What systems do we need? What data architecture do we need? Then what applications are we going to set on top of that? And in too many cases, I think hotel companies are taking it upon themselves to view application development as a core competency. I think very few hotel companies are going to win in that game of being a custom software application development shop. It's very expensive, and it almost always guarantees that you're a decade or more behind. And that's the big trend that we've been seeing. Now, getting your data architecture right, that's still essential regardless, because I agree with the premise that you need to have a solid data foundation that you can then plug applications on top of. Now, for really big, for large sophisticated organizations, you can use a Teradata solution. For smaller hotel companies, I'm sure there's a stripped down product, and I don't mean to, I'm not actually attacking Teradata's business, and they have a full feature cloud version. But a lot of smaller, less sophisticated organizations are going to have difficulty building up competent data architectures, and that's where they will continue to lean on Micros and Sabre and other organizations to build their applications directly on top of, because they're not going to have a major data warehousing project that they're going to be able to get budget to support. Anyway.
Briefly?
Just briefly.
Nope.
I mean, to me, the biggest the biggest obstacle here is the fact that in this industry, the source systems still see an API as a source of revenue. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, in some cases, we do interface, for example, with a data warehouse, because a company have taken data governance seriously. They have a data warehouse, and great. We can get all the data from there. We don't need to go in the source system. We're perfectly fine with that. The problem, though, is that most of the source system, even to get that data into the data warehouse, they charge quite a bit of money. And so that adds to the cost, and I think that's what is slowing down the industry. If these API were open and free or at a more reasonable cost, and they were standardized on both sides, and maybe the brand community was putting a little bit more pressure on the vendors doing that, I think that big data in the hospitality industry would be more rapid in their adoption. I think that's the big problem.
Thank you. Scott and team from Teradata, the admonition, stop thinking small about big data, comes from your website.
Yeah.
And can I, because I need to frame this so we can keep it fairly short, can you tell us where the small thinking is applying specifically within hospitality? As you build your practice, where are you seeing us not seeing the big picture? Where are you seeing opportunities?
That's a good question. I think different companies in this business are at different points, right? So I think that's part of it. Some are ahead of the game, some are behind the game. The good news on the technology front is the cost of doing a data warehouse is a lot less than it used to be. So smaller companies are moving in that direction. On the spectrum, thinking small would be thinking, I think, I need web data to do one thing with it, right? Versus I'm going to do lots of things, or I'm going to explore for patterns versus just grab certain attributes out of a web stream to plug into some application, right? So that's small thinking versus bigger thinking, I think. From our perspective, data volume isn't really that what we think about with big data. It's a lot of data. I mean, any website generates a ton of data, even if it's a fairly small website. But storing and using that isn't that hard anymore, right? We think of it in general as more complexity or diversity is really what defines what big data is all about. So, so I think if you look at it that way, it's a different way to look at it. But from a small versus large thinking, I think the larger thinking is collecting more and then leveraging it for lots of different things and making sure that everybody leverages the same base data. Means that however you roll it up, if you define things a certain way at the base layer, you're going to get the same answer, right? So a reservation is a reservation is a reservation, whether it came from mobile or social or your CRS or a GDS or an OTA. At one level, you care about all that, where it came from. But at another level, it's a reservation, right? And that base reservation is Dave is going to stay at the Platinum for 2 days at this rate, and here's his arrival date. That is common. It should be. If it's not, that's a bigger problem, right? So
all right. Thank you very much. And a quick follow-up, briefly.
So I'll relate a story in a similar industry, the car rental industry. Reservations, of course. Now, granted, their inventory can be moved, so that's a good thing for them. They have some flexibility in that area. But thinking small would be solving the problem with a Band-Aid, frankly, whatever the problem is, right? If the business says, I want to solve this problem, and then, oh, okay, well, let's just slap something on it and slap some code or whatever and solve that problem. But over time, we find that companies do that because it seems like it's an inexpensive way to solve problems. But you look 5 years down the road, you have this mess of spaghetti networking and multiple siloed information systems, and each one of those systems has a reporting system hanging off of it, and that's why you don't ever get the truth. So that's thinking small to me. Thinking big is saying, time out. We need to get a handle on our data, have a strategy first, to Scott's point, have an architecture, and put it all in one place so you can see the truth. If you can, thinking big to me is solving that problem. And then all the other problems become easier to solve because the data's in one place, the relationships are already established with the model. And so I think there's, so the new problems that come up with this unstructured data or this semi-structured data, it becomes easier to solve. Technology companies like us and everybody else on the technology side will always come up with an answer for you, believe me. Scott is working diligently on the next generation of whatever it is that I don't even know about yet. But it's exactly. But
Press
the
the button.
reality is, these appliances we talked about, they came about because they were needed. So certain tools are being developed in the toolbox to help you solve those problems. The key from our perspective is making it all seamless so that it fits into the architecture, so that the user doesn't even know where the data is coming from. They don't need to know where the data is coming from, frankly. They just need the data. And then I'm sure from your perspective, it's complex, right? It's very complex. You want to, I think the comment was made by Vineet about having the tools standardized to the users and so forth, and maybe it was Scott. But take, for example, SaaS users, right? Everybody seems to have SaaS, and there are some power users in your company, and it's an expensive application. And by the way, they're a partner of ours, just for the record, so nothing disparaging by any stretch of the imagination, all positive comments from me. But my point is, how do you get those power users to leverage all the data in all of your systems, as opposed to just leveraging that one tool that they have? Well, one way to do that is to make that tool accessible to all of your data, right? So apply the SaaS tool to all of the data. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can run the SaaS tool in the database where all the data resides. That's a new development that Scott and his team have been able to come up with over the past few years as an example. So what I'm saying is the technology companies will make it easier for you to make it seamless to your end users. Thinking big is attacking all the problems and getting all the data in one place and governed, manageable, and reducing your costs in the long term by thinking big. I think thinking small is the constant approach of the Band-Aid here, the Band-Aid there, and at the end of the day, you're creating more cost and you're making it more difficult to fix that problem down the road.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that Matt had a question.
Well, so I didn't really get an answer to my previous question, so maybe I'll toss it to you guys. How big is big data? And let me preface that just by describing that, you know, we talked about Hadoop, right? Hadoop basically came out of, you know, a team that looked at the MapReduce paper that Google published and said, yeah, we can do that. We'll do an open source version. Great. So the difference is companies like Google and Yahoo and Amazon and Facebook, these are web scale big data companies. They had to invent those technologies because there was no solution out there on the market. So they created it themselves, right? A lot of really smart PhDs from Stanford, et cetera. My question is, does the hospitality industry have that type of big data problem? How big is big data? Is it, you know, a couple terabytes? Is it a petabyte? Is it 100 petabytes?
So I'll go back to the first thing in my presentation. Big data is not about size. It's the last thing it's about. It's a misnomer. It's about the new kinds of data and the new data structures and the new analytics that get driven from that. Like, instead of joining your reservation table to your customer table to understand, you know, your most profitable customers and their upcoming reservations, that's a very structured relational thing. And we can scale that to petabytes, or we can do it really small on a laptop. It's about, how do I go find the common paths that a customer takes when interacting with my business, website, on-premise, call center, and what did they do when they were there? What was the outcome? And what did that do to change their behavior over time? That's not a relational thing. That's pattern matching, right? So let's go back to what you described about the big data thing and the Googles and Yahoos, and they invented this technology. They invented this technology because the technology didn't exist to do what they needed to do, and that is to build great big indexes for web searches, okay? And that was the technology that they invented, and that was the MapReduce paper from Google. And frankly, I mean, the Hadoop open source version came from Yahoo, which spun out to Hortonworks and all this kind of stuff. They did that because they needed a file system that could be very flexible, that could be massively parallel and highly distributed, so that they could run a very specific analytic, which is creating heat maps of search indexes so that when you go run a search, you get relevant pages. That's what they invented. Okay, now, that tool is also applicable to other things because it's a very open and generic and scalable file system. So that's kind of the key. But it's really not even about the size. You could scale it infinitely if you want, and that's fine. It's about the variety of the data. So getting back to the path analytic or digital market attribution, some of the new things that include social and pattern matching are not relational. And some of these new tools, the Discovery Platform, Hadoop, and MapReduce, actually let you do that. And so that's actually what's interesting and not the volume. The volumes can be tens of terabytes into petabytes. I'll also say that, you know, from a size perspective, where we have customers who are doing data warehousing and they're doing also data lakes and Hadoop and all this kind of stuff, their Discovery Platform / data warehouse is actually usually bigger than their Hadoop cluster, right? And that's because that becomes where they keep their corporate relevance and their corporate history and their knowledge about the business, and it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. The data lake can be very transient. Do you really need to have the weblog of my interaction on your website from 10 years ago? I don't know. Is that relevant? Is anybody ever going to look at it? But do you want to know how much I spent at your property 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago? That's relevant from a trending perspective. So volume is very misleading. I think it's really more about kind of the extension of what these new analytics do. Now, I think back to the small thinking, big thinking, right? So social media is a big thing. It's unstructured data. It's on the web. You have to purchase it. You have to bring it in. You want to know, what are people saying about your brand? What are people saying about, and that's very, very interesting. But it's only interesting in and buying a point solution for that is interesting, but I think that's an example of small thinking. It's very interesting when you tie that information back to what you know about those customers specifically. Are they profitable customers? Are they customers you're going after? Are they customers you're not going after? So that you can actually take the appropriate action. And so the big data thing is really about, I think, this new analytics and not volumes. That said, I mean, we have customers that are tens of terabytes to the biggest is 87 petabytes and everywhere in between. And the technology itself, what I think is important is to not worry about the volume, but make sure the technology and the architecture you choose is scalable seamlessly across that environment, because it's going to change. You might buy a new chain and now you have twice as many properties. Your data volumes are going to double. You don't want to have to re-architect everything. You just want it to scale. Scalability is really important, and then flexibility.
Thank you very much. Patrick, do you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I have a quick one. That said, some relevant statistics, right? We've got the biggest database we have in the lodging industry is probably about 30 terabytes for a large chain, right? I think that was a forklift, frankly, of a different technology, so there's probably some duplicate in there, right? So if I were guessing, I would say it's probably more like 15 to 20 of raw data that's not duplicated, right? Over time, they're re-architecting that to be more like what we've described here today. So that's fairly relevant. The largest gaming customer we have is about 15 terabytes. And these are data warehouse sizes, right? Down to some that are a few hundred gigabytes, right? A lodging management company, for example. So it varies all over. From a big data perspective, the gaming company I'm talking about is looking at about a 300 terabyte big data Hadoop cluster, right? So again, that's just relative sizes is what we're seeing, right?
Good.
Again, to Scott's point, it's really more about scalability, and the size problem isn't as big a deal as it used to be.
Great. Thank you for those statistics. Patrick, did you have a very quick follow-up?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Even with all the hotel companies we work with combining all of their data, my co-founder Craig, who used to be the CTO at Salesforce, describes us as a medium data company, even aggregating many hotel companies' data together. So we're definitely not dealing with web scale type things. Now the data sets can get quite large. We're tracking clickstream data from hotel booking engines, which can take up a lot of space. For us, the biggest, the way we use the word big data in the hotel space is that when you do see a new type of data that could really fundamentally change the way you market your hotels. If the answer is, if the answer is we don't have a data warehouse to throw it into, that's kind of bad. If the answer is, well, our data warehouse, it takes so long to get data in, and it'll become this big process, and there's a 3-year plan on that side, and so let's drop it into the planning cycle, and hopefully in 3 to 5 years we can get the data in. That's a pretty dangerous answer. And so for me, big data, at least to some extent, has to describe an openness to new sources of data, an openness to being flexible with moving forward. And that's not really a technology-driven thing. It's as much how those technologies are implemented in the culture of the organization and a whole lot of other factors. But we end up functioning as a data warehouse for our customers to a large extent because we have the ability to structure their data, make it usable, expose it to a lot of different teams in the ways that they need it, and we actually control the data governance then so that all of the different teams are seeing the same answer from the same system. And then if there's a key new piece of information they need to make decisions, we go out, grab it, drop it into MongoDB, and we can, within weeks, have a prototype of an adjustment to an app or a view of the data for them, which these organizations can't do themselves in many, many cases. And so embracing that big data mentality is just getting more flexible in terms of being able to get data into business processes quickly and efficiently, from my perspective.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Our time is drawing to an end, so it's time to ask the wrap-up question. And the wrap-up question is this: first to Teradata and then to Duetto Research. What are the key messages about your company in this topic that you hope the hoteliers in front of you, the hoteliers on the phone line, and the hoteliers watching this video, what are these key messages that you would like them to take away from this conversation? Teradata, please.
So I'd say there's probably several, but a couple of top of mind for me is I hope we've helped everybody understand a little more about what this space is all about. And hopefully you get the feeling from our discussion today that we'd be happy to help you with these types of problems should you have them. So those are the two key things here. We believe that a unified architecture, whether it's on our technology or someone else's technology, like we described in the presentation, is a key to being successful with leveraging this stuff. And I think there's a lot of expertise out there that can help you. You're not Google. You don't have 4,000 web developers and 4,000 MapReduce developers on staff. There are tools out there to help you leverage this kind of data without having to have that kind of in-house capabilities. So.
Thank you very much. Duetto Research.
I'll get back to the very specific ask, which is I think that the industry needs to start demanding that all of the different players develop and deploy means of sharing data in a common format through standard messaging such that an ecosystem of different applications can be developed alongside each of these different systems. I really hope that everyone will embrace integrated data warehouses and the other systems that Teradata, or appliances that Teradata described. But also in the meantime, companies like the ones I've named before, Micros, Synexus, the in-house systems you have that have been developed at some of the companies that are around the tables today. I just think there needs to be a broad agreement in the industry that allowing each of these different applications to have their own standards and their own rules, and saying, well, we don't do that, we don't support that, we have no way of allowing you to pull out a year's worth of reservation data efficiently, is an unacceptable answer. And until the hoteliers actually start saying, I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable, make that a priority for your development, make sure that all of our systems can communicate openly and agree on what is a reservation message, what is this, what is that, and here's a bulk methodology for beginning to communicate it through some sort of SOAP or REST, or, the specific technologies almost don't matter, but we need to get all of the different vendors, including your in-house IT people, to all get on the same page that this is a priority. Otherwise, we're going to be doing weird piecemeal custom development for the next decade. And honestly, I continue to believe that that environment is what holds us back from innovating more rapidly as a hotel supplier and brand community, and will continue to hold us back from getting very good at mobile marketing and online marketing and distribution and all of the other competencies that we need to get good at. So I hope that Htng will hear enough interest from the people in the room to kind of kick off a spec writing initiative around creating a bulk analytic API initiative for all of the different systems that play in the space.
Duetto Research, Teradata, thank you very much. We've enjoyed your information, your remarks, your comments. I find myself reflecting on everything I've heard and thinking that more and more with big data, the issue is not finding the right answer, it's finding the right question. You've helped us in that respect. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, thank you very much. This concludes the Htng Strategic Leadership Engagement Series presentation, Big Data and Analytics. Thank you very much.